The auctioneer's gavel fell with a hollow thud that echoed across the dusty courthouse steps. Colton Ryder stared at the wooden hammer, then at the deed being handed to him, then back at the crowd of bidders who had mysteriously stopped raising their hands when the price hit $12,000. For a ranch worth at least $200,000, something was very wrong. The woman beside him whispered congratulations, but her eyes held pity instead of excitement. The other ranchers avoided his gaze entirely, shuffling away as if he had just signed his own death warrant instead of bought property. Colton folded the deed into his jacket pocket, feeling the rough paper crinkle against his chest. 3 days ago, he had been a laid-off mechanic from Phoenix with nothing but a truck, $8,000 in savings, and a desperate need for a fresh start. The Whitmore Ranch had appeared in the auction listings like a gift from heaven. 47 acres of prime Texas hill country, complete with a farmhouse, barn, and water rights. The photos showed weathered buildings but solid bones underneath. Now, standing in the afternoon heat outside the Kendall County Courthouse, he wondered why nobody else had wanted it. The listing mentioned structural repairs needed and outdated electrical systems, but nothing that would scare away every other bidder. He had prepared to fight tooth and nail against other ranchers, investors, and developers. Instead, the auction had felt like watching dominoes fall in reverse, with each potential buyer stepping back just as the bidding started to climb. His phone buzzed against his leg, a known number with a local area code. Colton let it ring through to voicemail while he walked toward his truck, boots scraping against the concrete steps. The courthouse square was emptying fast, as if everyone wanted to be somewhere else before something happened. The voicemail notification appeared immediately. He pressed play while fishing for his keys. "Mr. Ryder, this is Marcus Webb from Meridian Energy Corporation. We understand you just acquired the Whitmore property. We'd like to discuss a very generous offer for immediate resale. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. Time is of the essence." Colton stopped walking. Meridian Energy Corporation. He had heard that name before. Usually attached to news stories about oil drilling and natural gas extraction. Usually attached to very large numbers and very controversial projects. He played the message again, noting the urgency in the man's voice, the careful emphasis on immediate resale and time being of the essence. His truck sat alone in the parking lot now, baking under the Texas sun. The courthouse square had emptied completely, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the oak trees and the distant hum of traffic on Highway 27. He looked back at the courthouse steps where he had just bought his future for the price of a used car. Something was buried under that ranch. Something worth enough money to make a billion-dollar corporation start making calls before the ink dried on the deed. And whatever it was, he was about to find out why everyone else had been too scared to bid. The drive to his new property took 40 minutes through winding back roads that carved between limestone hills and mesquite thickets. Colton's truck rattled over cattle guards and through gate after gate, each one marking another step away from civilization and deeper into the heart of Texas ranch country. The GPS signal flickered in and out, leaving him to navigate by the hand-drawn map the courthouse clerk had sketched on the back of a gas receipt. When he finally reached the entrance to the Whitmore Ranch, his heart sank. The metal gate hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the wooden sign bearing the ranch name had been shot full of holes. Beyond the gate, a dirt road disappeared into a tunnel of oak trees that blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight. This was not the picturesque entrance he had imagined from the auction photos. He drove slowly down the gravel drive, noting the deep tire tracks that scored the dirt in parallel lines. Heavy machinery had been here recently, and lots of it. The tracks were too wide for ranch equipment, too precise for casual vehicles. They looked like the kind of marks left by geological survey trucks or drilling equipment. The farmhouse appeared through the trees like something from a different century. 2 stories of whitewashed wood and native stone, with a wraparound porch that sagged under the weight of neglect. But the windows were intact, the roof looked solid, and someone had been maintaining the property more recently than the auction listing had suggested. The grass around the house was cut short, and fresh tire tracks led to a large metal barn behind the main building. Colton parked near the front porch and stepped out into air that smelled of cedar, dust, and something else he couldn't identify. Something chemical and sharp that didn't belong in ranch country. He walked around the house, noting details the auction photos had missed. Professional surveyor stakes marked with bright orange flags dotted the property in a grid pattern. Core sample holes had been drilled near the barn, leaving small piles of different colored soil and rock scattered across the yard. His phone rang again. Same unknown number. "Mr. Ryder, Marcus Webb again from Meridian Energy. I hope you had a chance to consider our message. We're prepared to offer you 5 times what you paid at auction. Cash, closing within 48 hours. No inspections, no contingencies. 5 times $12,000 was $60,000. More than enough to buy a decent house somewhere else and start over with money left in the bank. But the desperation in Webb's voice made Colton's jaw tighten. "What's the rush?" Colton asked. "Excuse me? I bought this place 2 hours ago and you're already calling with offers. What's so special about it?" The line went quiet for several seconds. When Webb spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of casual business conversation. "Mr. Ryder, there are larger forces at work here than you understand. Forces that can make your life very comfortable or very complicated, depending on your cooperation. I strongly advise you to take our offer. And if I don't?" The silence stretched long enough for Colton to hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "Then you'll discover why everyone else was smart enough to walk away." Colton hung up the phone and stared at the screen until it went dark. The threat had been clear enough, wrapped in corporate politeness but sharp as barbed wire underneath. He walked toward the barn, boots crunching on gravel that sparkled with flecks of something that wasn't quite right for Texas hill country. The rocks looked ordinary from a distance, but up close they held an unusual metallic sheen that caught the sunlight like broken glass. The barn doors stood partially open, revealing heavy tire tracks that led inside and disappeared into shadow. Colton pulled his phone flashlight and stepped through the doorway into air that smelled of diesel fuel and fresh concrete. Someone had poured new foundation slabs throughout the interior, creating a smooth floor where hay bales and farm equipment should have been stored. Industrial lighting fixtures hung from the rafters, and electrical conduits ran along the walls in neat parallel lines. This wasn't a barn anymore. It was a staging area. Metal storage containers lined the back wall, each one marked with shipping labels and corporate logos he didn't recognize. The closest container stood slightly open, revealing drilling equipment that looked expensive and specialized. Core sampling devices, geological survey instruments, and boxes of sample containers filled the space inside. Everything was clean, organized, and ready for immediate deployment. A sound outside made him freeze. Vehicle engines, more than one, approaching fast down the gravel drive. Colton switched off his flashlight and moved to the barn door, staying in shadow while he watched 3 black SUVs pull up to the farmhouse. Men in dark suits climbed out, moving with the controlled precision of people who carried weapons professionally. The lead man was tall and lean, with silver hair and the kind of expensive watch that cost more than most people's cars. He surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of someone conducting an inspection rather than a visit. When he spoke to his companions, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Colton's phone buzzed with a text message. Same number as the earlier calls. "Mr. Ryder, we're at your property now. Please join us at the house. We have a contract ready for your signature." They had come prepared to close the deal today, assuming he would cave to their pressure. The assumption made his jaw tighten with anger that surprised him with its intensity. 6 months ago, he would have taken their money and walked away grateful. But 6 months ago, he had still believed that working hard and following rules would be enough to build a decent life. The layoffs at the repair shop had taught him that other people's decisions could destroy everything he had built without warning or apology. He had spent his last dollar on this ranch because it represented something no corporation could take away from him. Now they were standing on his property, making demands as if his ownership meant nothing. The silver-haired man checked his watch and said something to his companions that made them spread out around the farmhouse. They weren't planning to leave without an answer. Colton stepped back deeper into the barn shadow and considered his options. He could walk out there, sign their contract, and drive away $60,000 richer. Or he could find out what was buried under his land that made billion-dollar corporations bring armed men to country auctions. Colton slipped out the back of the barn and made his way through the oak trees that bordered the property. The men at the farmhouse would expect him to approach from the main drive, giving him a few minutes to circle around and reach his truck without being seen. Branches caught at his jacket as he moved between the trees, trying to keep the barn between himself and the house. His truck sat in plain view near the front porch, keys still in his pocket. Getting to it would mean crossing 40 yards of open ground while 3 armed men waited for him to appear. Not good odds for someone whose military experience was limited to fixing engines at supply bases rather than combat operations. The sound of his phone ringing echoed across the property. He had forgotten to silence it, and the electronic melody cut through the afternoon quiet like an alarm. The men at the house turned toward the sound, scanning the tree line with professional alertness. Colton pressed himself against an oak trunk and let the call go to voicemail. Through the branches, he could see the silver-haired man speaking into his own phone while his companions moved toward the barn with practiced coordination. They would find the open door and know he had been inside. They would find his truck and know he was still on the property. His phone buzzed with a text notification. Different number this time, local area code. Mr. Ryder, this is Elena Santos, attorney. Heard about your auction win. If Meridian Energy contacts you, don't sign anything. Meet me at Rosita's Diner on Main Street in Bourne. Come alone and watch for tails. Colton stared at the message. Someone was watching his situation closely enough to know about corporate pressure that had started less than 3 hours ago. Either Elena Santos had connections inside Meridian Energy, or she was monitoring property auctions for reasons he didn't understand yet. The men searching the barn had found something interesting. Their voices carried across the property, discussing equipment and timeline issues in the clipped tones of people executing a plan. One of them mentioned soil samples and mineral assays, terms that made more sense of the drilling equipment he had seen in the storage containers. They weren't just interested in buying his ranch. They were preparing to extract something from underneath it. Colton worked his way deeper into the trees, moving parallel to the fence line that marked his property boundary. The mesquite thickets provided cover, but they also blocked his view of the men searching for him. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves sounded loud enough to give away his position. His phone rang again. Marcus Webb's number. This time Colton answered, keeping his voice low. Where are you? Mr. Ryder? We have paperwork ready for immediate signature. Very generous terms. I'm thinking about it. Think faster. Our offer expires at sunset. The threat was barely disguised now. Sign by sunset or face consequences they weren't bothering to hide anymore. What happens at sunset? Colton asked. Legal complications begin. Environmental assessments, geological surveys, federal involvement, the kind of bureaucratic problems that can tie up property for years while lawyers get rich and owners get nothing. Colton reached the fence line and could see a ranch road beyond his property boundary. If he could get over the fence without being spotted, he could follow the road to the highway and find another way back to his truck later. I'll call you back, he said. Mr. Ryder, don't make this more difficult than necessary. People who fight Meridian Energy tend to lose more than just money. The line went dead. Behind him, voices were getting closer. Colton climbed over the fence and jogged down the ranch road until he reached Highway 46. The walk to Bourne took an hour, giving him time to think about Elena Santos, and why a lawyer was monitoring property auctions closely enough to know about corporate pressure within hours. By the time he reached Main Street, the sun was setting behind the hill country, casting long shadows between the limestone buildings that lined the old German settlement. Rosita's Diner sat on a corner lot with large windows that offered clear views of the street in both directions. Elena Santos was easy to spot even from outside. Late 30s, professional clothes that looked expensive but practical, and the kind of alert posture that suggested she spent a lot of time watching for trouble. She had chosen a booth in the back corner with sight lines to every entrance. She stood when he entered, extending a firm handshake that lasted exactly long enough to assess his character without making him uncomfortable. Mr. Ryder, thank you for coming. We need to talk about what you bought today, and we need to do it quickly. Elena placed a thick manila folder on the table between them. The tab read, Meridian Energy v. Local Landowners. Pattern Analysis. Meridian Energy has acquired 17 properties in this county over the past 14 months. Every acquisition followed the same pattern. Property goes to auction under suspicious circumstances. Local bidders are discouraged through various means. One outsider wins at below market price. Within days, Meridian makes an offer they expect will be accepted immediately. Colton opened the folder and saw aerial photographs, geological surveys, and legal documents. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Ranches, farms, and undeveloped land parcels, all acquired through identical methods. What happens to people who refuse their offers? Elena's expression darkened. Legal harassment. Environmental investigations that tie up properties for years. Sudden tax assessments. Building code violations that appear overnight. Banking problems that make financing impossible. One rancher had his water rights challenged after his family had used the same well for 6 generations. She pulled out a geological survey marked with technical annotations. Your property sits on top of one of the largest lithium deposits in North America. Lithium is essential for electric vehicle batteries, power grid storage, and renewable energy systems. The global demand has increased by 400% in the past 5 years. The scope of what he had stumbled into began to crystallize. This wasn't about oil or natural gas. This was about the future of energy storage and transportation. Every electric car battery, every solar power installation, every grid-scale energy storage system required lithium. And apparently, he was sitting on enough of it to attract billion-dollar corporations. How much is my land worth? Conservative estimate based on current lithium prices and accessible deposits. $200 million. Maybe more if extraction costs are favorable. Colton stared at the geological data, trying to process numbers that large. Yesterday, he had been a laid-off mechanic. Now he owned mineral rights worth more than most small countries' annual budgets. Why are you helping me? Elena closed the folder and met his eyes directly. Because Meridian Energy destroyed my family's ranch last year using these exact same tactics. My father lost land that had been in our family for 4 generations. I've been building a case against them ever since, waiting for someone willing to fight back instead of taking their money and walking away. Elena drove him back to the ranch in her pickup truck, taking back roads to avoid the main highway where Meridian's vehicles might be waiting. The black SUVs were gone from his property, but they had left clear evidence of their search. Every storage container in the barn had been opened, and fresh tire tracks crisscrossed the entire property in systematic patterns. Colton walked to the core sample holes near the barn and knelt down to examine the extracted soil more closely. In the fading daylight, he could see what he had missed earlier. The deeper samples contained rock fragments that sparkled with an unusual metallic luster, and the soil itself had a distinctive grayish-white color that didn't match the typical red clay of Texas hill country. Elena crouched beside him and pointed to specific layers in the soil samples. See these white and gray deposits? That's spodumene ore, the primary source of lithium. These darker fragments are probably lepidolite, another lithium-bearing mineral. The concentrations look high enough to justify industrial extraction. She pulled out her phone and took detailed photographs of the soil samples, making sure to capture the GPS coordinates and depth measurements that were still marked on the surveyor stakes. A car engine approached down the gravel drive, not the aggressive rumble of the SUVs, but the steady purr of an expensive sedan. A silver Mercedes pulled up to the farmhouse, and Marcus Webb stepped out alone. He wore a different suit than his companions, better tailored and more expensive, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by people who mattered. Mr. Ryder, I see you've been discussing your situation with outside parties. That's unfortunate. Elena stood up slowly, brushing soil from her hands. Marcus Webb, Meridian Energy's chief acquisition officer. We've met before. Ms. Santos, still fighting battles you can't win. I see. Webb pulled out a legal document and handed it to Colton. Environmental Protection Agency inspection notice, effective immediately. Your property has been reported for potential groundwater contamination. All development, excavation, and occupancy is suspended pending federal investigation. Colton scanned the document. Official letterhead, case numbers, and enough technical language to make his head spin. The investigation could take months or years to complete, during which time he couldn't live on his own property or make any modifications to the land. You reported groundwater contamination on property you want to buy? Webb's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Meridian Energy is a responsible corporate citizen. When we notice potential environmental hazards, we have a duty to report them to appropriate authorities. The fact that our offer to purchase contaminated property demonstrates our commitment to proper remediation should be seen as generous rather than suspicious. Elena stepped forward, her voice cold with controlled anger. How convenient that your environmental concerns only appeared after Mr. Ryder refused your initial offer. Environmental protection doesn't operate on convenient schedules. Ms. Santos. Sometimes responsible corporations must make difficult decisions for the greater good. Webb turned back to Colton. Our offer remains valid for another 12 hours. After that, you'll be dealing with federal agencies, environmental lawyers, and remediation costs that will exceed the value of your property by several $1 million. The message was clear. Sign tonight, or spend years fighting government bureaucracy while legal bills destroyed any hope of profit. They had moved from direct threats to systemic pressure, using federal agencies as weapons against individual property owners. Webb walked back to his Mercedes, leaving the EPA notice in Colton's hands like a death sentence wrapped in official paperwork. Elena spent the night helping Colton research legal precedents and federal environmental procedures. They worked by lamplight at the kitchen table, surrounded by law books, geological surveys, and corporate documents that painted a clear picture of Meridian Energy's systematic acquisition strategy. The EPA investigation would take 18 months minimum, during which time Colton could neither live on his property nor generate any income from it. At sunrise, 3 white vans arrived bearing EPA logos and environmental testing equipment. The federal agents were professional and thorough, collecting soil samples, testing water sources, and documenting every detail of the property. Their supervisor, a woman in her 50s with government credentials and tired eyes, explained that the investigation had been triggered by anonymous reports of potential heavy metal contamination. Elena watched the federal agents work with the expression of someone who had seen this exact procedure before. They'll find trace amounts of naturally occurring minerals that pose no actual threat, but the investigation will drag on until legal costs force you to sell. It's a standard corporate playbook. By noon, Meridian Energy had set up a command trailer at the property boundary, just outside the EPA investigation zone. Marcus Webb had been replaced by Victoria Kane herself, the CEO whose reputation for ruthless acquisition strategies was legendary throughout the energy industry. She arrived in a motorcade that included lawyers, financial advisors, and security personnel who made no effort to conceal their weapons. Kane walked directly to the farmhouse where Colton and Elena waited on the front porch. She was younger than expected, mid-40s with the kind of focused intensity that comes from building billion-dollar companies through personal determination rather than inherited wealth. Mr. Ryder, I'm here to make this simple for you. $100 million cash transfer within 24 hours, all legal complications disappear overnight. You walk away wealthy enough to buy any property in Texas that interests you. The offer was 10 times larger than anything Webb had proposed. Enough money to buy a dozen ranches and live comfortably for several lifetimes. Enough money to solve every financial problem he had ever faced. What's the catch? No catch. We want this property, and we're willing to pay fair market value for it. The EPA investigation was simply meant to demonstrate what happens when people choose conflict over cooperation. Elena stepped forward, her voice sharp with controlled anger. Fair market value for a $200 million lithium deposit is not $100 million. Kane's smile never wavered. Mrs. Santos, you're assuming extraction costs, environmental permits, and community relations expenses don't factor into profitability calculations. $100 million is more than generous for undeveloped mineral rights in a regulatory climate that becomes more restrictive every year. She turned back to Colton. This offer expires when the sun sets tonight. After that, you'll spend years fighting federal agencies while your property becomes worthless. Environmental investigations have a way of expanding beyond their original scope. Kane walked back toward her command trailer, leaving behind a check already written for $100 million. The signature line waited for Colton's decision. Elena picked up the check and stared at the amount. It's real. This check would clear without any problems. Colton looked at the federal agents documenting his property, then at the Meridian Energy command trailer, where decisions affecting his future were being made by people who had never set foot in Texas before this week. Colton stared at the check for $100 million, then walked to Elena's truck and retrieved the manila folder containing documentation of Meridian Energy's illegal acquisition pattern. He had spent his entire adult life being told what his work was worth, what his time was worth, what his future was worth. Today, he would decide for himself. He walked directly to the EPA supervisor and handed her the complete file of evidence. Ma'am, I believe your investigation should expand to include systematic fraud and corruption charges against Meridian Energy Corporation. This folder contains documentation of 17 illegal property acquisitions using fraudulent environmental reports. The federal agent examined the evidence with growing interest. Patterns of false EPA reports, intimidation tactics, and coordinated efforts to manipulate federal agencies. Within 30 minutes, she was on the phone with FBI white-collar crime divisions and federal prosecutors. Victoria Kane arrived at the farmhouse as federal agents began surrounding the Meridian Energy command trailer. Her composure finally cracked when she realized her entire operation was being documented by federal investigators. Mr. Ryder, you're making a serious mistake. That check represents more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. You're right, Colton said. But it's not my money. It's stolen from 17 families whose land you took through fraud. Elena stepped beside him, holding her phone which had been recording the entire conversation. Ms. Kane, you've just admitted on camera that Meridian Energy has been systematically defrauding landowners. This recording will be very helpful to federal prosecutors. The FBI agents placed Kane under arrest 40 minutes later. The environmental investigation was suspended pending criminal proceedings, and Meridian Energy's assets were frozen by federal court order. The company's stock price collapsed when news of the federal charges reached financial markets. Colton kept his property and negotiated a legitimate mining lease with Tesla Corporation, which paid fair market value for extraction rights while allowing him to remain on his land. The deal provided him with $25 million up front and ongoing royalty payments that would generate income for decades. Elena established a legal practice specializing in corporate fraud cases, using the Meridian Energy conviction as the foundation for representing other victims of illegal acquisition schemes. She helped recover stolen properties for 12 of the 17 families who had been defrauded. 6 months later, Colton stood on his front porch watching Tesla's extraction teams work with environmental scientists to harvest lithium through sustainable methods that protected local water sources and wildlife habitats. His property had become a model for responsible resource extraction, balancing economic development with environmental protection. The farmhouse had been restored to its original condition, and the barn had been converted into a workshop where Colton repaired equipment for local ranchers. He had found the fresh start he had been looking for, not by running away from his problems, but by refusing to let powerful people take what belonged to him. The midday sun shone brightly over the Texas hills, illuminating the restored ranch that now represented everything he had fought to achieve. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where ordinary people face extraordinary challenges in the American West. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.